All right, hello, welcome back. They're mowing outside, so welcome to my living room. This is going to be chapter 3, The Age of Nationalism. So really we're going to cover up until the late 60s, 1967 war. Um, and so this is the sort of post-colonial period, the reestablishment of a lot of sort of nation states, the throwing off of, I don't know, external influences like the UK and France, etc. All right. So, section 3.1, what is nationalism? They define it as attachment on a national scale to a piece of territory, reinforced by common bonds of identity such as shared symbols, historical experience, language, folklore, whatever else creates a sense of commonality. And I would add things like heroes. They're pretty important in different national discourses and nationalism in general, right? Like each state has its different heroic analogies and heroes that they try to sort of put on modern society and all these sorts of things. The core components, of course, of this definition are territory, right? So we're moving into the age of territory and sovereignty, right? And we're really solidifying what the map looks like post World War II. And then second, national scope, right? And the author says, often achieved only through active ideological, political, and at times even military agitation on the part of political leaders and the states, right? And so this was a pretty major influence. There was a lot of repression, not only under the Ottoman Empire, but then moving into sort of statehood, right? You got a lot of military dictatorships, or if they were purported democracies, there was a whole lot of turmoil or turnover or I don't know, whatever you want to call it, right? With coups and then overturning prime ministers and presidents all the time and this kind of stuff. During the collapse of while the empires are collapsing and the new state borders are started forming, the elites, in some sense, like we talked about before with Kemal Ataturk and Pahlavi, they had to create nationalist feelings, right? Instead of seeing, instead of citizens seeing themselves as part of the, I don't know, Ottoman Empire or a regional piece of the empire or whatever it might be, now we're creating states, right? And so there needs to be new language built around that, new propaganda, new terms, right? A lot of these states didn't even really have a name, it had to be made up. And then, of course, a lot of the political leaders like Pahlavi and Ataturk took on some sort of symbolic name for themselves to root themselves sort of in this reformist movement and to create statehood in a sense, right? Um, there are a couple reasons why nationalism, right? One, we know it's politically palatable. Once it's sort of set and can be manipulated, it can really be used pretty powerfully, right? And we see that not only in the Middle East, but also in the West and the United States, all these sorts of things, right? It can also help to solidify territorial control, right? Just sovereignty over your geographical boundaries. As discussed before, sometimes the jurisprudence or whatever it might be called over areas outside of the urban regions could be questionable, right? Like, look at a state like Mexico today, where 40 to 50% of the state is not really controlled by the state, right? 40 to 50% of, I guess I should say, the geographical territory is not controlled by the state apparatus. It's either, I don't know, no man's land kind of in a sense, or drug cartels, etc. The same can be seen in South Africa. Yeah, so it becomes difficult, and creating a nationalist symbol and terminology and all this kind of stuff can help you really wrap up control in the hinterlands. I don't know what you would call them. It can also help with state legitimacy, right, and tax collection. If you see yourself as part of a territorial entity with some sense of um, self control, you're going to be more willing to sort of maybe listen to the state, bow to the state, pay your taxes, right? All of which is necessary to garner further control and legitimacy, right? But without a tax base and these sorts of things, or legitimacy in general, you kind of get chaos and just like uh, bureaucracy in name only, or a government in name only, right? Finally, it can help with military, right? Nationalism can drum up um, military soldiers, volunteers, or it can make conscription easier. These sorts of things, right? And it can also help to ease the arguments about military expenditures as a portion of GDP and all of these sorts of things, right? The guns versus butter argument. For those of you who don't know, right, like everything in this world basically has what are called opportunity costs. And so, um, from an economic perspective, every choice you make has alternative choices that have other benefits or costs, right? And so, in some sense, the state has to decide, what are we going to spend our money on, either the taxes and or the debt, or for rentier states like the petroleum income, etc. Right? But there are payoffs or trade-offs to be made between guns, the military, and butter, right? Social spending and infrastructure, these sorts of things. And so a nationalist perspective and a nationalist discourse in a society can help to ease some of those guns versus butter arguments. All right. It is a difficult needle to thread, though, right? Between sort of just complete noncompliance and illegitimacy of the state, like they're putting out um, dictates, but no one really cares, right? And nor do they have the functionality of a police or anything like that to be able to sort of enforce the laws. To sort of the other extreme, where you have sort of military jingoism, and this discourse is forcing you in some ways into wars and these sorts of things, right? So you can think of Sudan during much of their existence, Egypt at times, Turkey at times, arguably Russia now. Um, they've really built up their military, and they've built up this nationalism as sort of, I don't know, the saviors of the West and fighting Nazism in Ukraine and other areas or whatever. Like I don't really see much to the argument, but they handle the media outlets, right? And in some sense, the argument from Russia is that we need to expand and take back our former Soviet glory and these sorts of things, right? Which, in some senses, can force Putin and the leaders into these sort of expansionary adventurism or whatever it is. All right, and then finally, Israel, right? Are they being sort of forced into um, the same trap, right, with their really high levels of sort of nationalism and bordering on like xenophobia and these sorts of things? um, the rise of the far right and Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister for the last, I think it's like 16 or 17 years, periodically, but most of that time. Um, is this sort of thing also leading them into war? Arguably, retaliation for October 7 wouldn't really fit into that model, but a lot of their behavior in recent years would sort of fit into that model. But Russia and Israel are, questionable or tangential here. All right. Arab nationalism, as sort of pan-Arabism, right, which we'll get into over the next couple of chapters, but Arab nationalism in general, the thought was floating around as the Ottoman Empire collapses, but it's largely traced back to Ali Hussein and the Hussein-McMahon documents, in the agreement that we talked about with trying to undermine the Ottoman Empire, and supporting the Allies during World War One. It really peaks during the Ottoman collapse, and then arguably later under Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. But I would say that there were a lot of ideas with what to do with that area, both externally from excuse me, British, Russian, French interests, but also internally, right? It was a huge sort of amorphous area. There were many, many different cultures and philosophies and legal systems and all kinds of stuff. And so there was an opportunity for change as the Ottoman Empire collapses. And I'm not really a big fan of sort of historical determinism. I don't think that it had to end up the way that it did, but we're going to talk about how it did end up the way it did, right? And I'm going to focus on a lot of those sort of larger level global documents and discussions in the supplemental lecture that I'll add after these two. All right. So chapter 4 really focuses on 4 versions of nationalism, that are rising post World War II. I'll cover a couple and I'll leave a couple really. I'm going to cover Israel's rise, in the supplemental. We'll talk about Palestine. We'll definitely hit on Egypt because it's a very important history that that doesn't really get discussed a lot. And then I'll touch on sort of Northern Africa at the end. Okay. So the birth of Israel and Zionism. Um, Again, I'm going to touch on this on the supplemental. Um, the Jewish people basically had been facing persecution since, historically forever, for a long time. But it really started to rise in the late 1800s in the industrial period. And so you start to see Russian pogroms or like forced encampments and cultural assimilation, these sorts of things, in the late 19th century, 1880s, 1890s. Zionism starts to rise as sort of a political philosophy during this time. The idea that, Jewish people should stop trying to assimilate into the cultures wherein they are trying to live and instead have their own sort of national homeland, right? Um, you saw a lot of movement on this in the precursor and during World War One. These are where a lot of the documents that we'll talk about come for: Balfour Declaration, Sykes-Picot Agreement, McMahon-Hussein documents, these sorts of things. And really, you see a lot of immigration into Jerusalem area, over the next, I would say, like 1890s to 1930s, right, where it really starts to explode as Hitler rises to power and the economy is collapsing into the Great Depression and these sorts of things. And then, of course, we get the atrocities from Hitler's Holocaust, in Germany and Poland and other countries, Austria, etc., France. And there's sort of mass exodus post World War II. Israel becomes a state in 1948. Basically, the Palestinian Mandate ends and they declare independence that day or the next morning or something, and become an independent state. And much of sort of Zionist or Jewish nationalism, Israeli nationalism, whatever you want to call it, was sort of built from the ground up over time and inserted into an area, which is interesting because we don't see much of that historically. Um, and so I don't know what sort of, like, we can draw conclusions and these sorts of things from the experience, but it's hard to sort of put it in a data set, right? And understand how these nationalist movements work because they're pretty rare. All right. Section 3.3, Palestinian nationalism, in many ways is sort of a reaction to not only the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and what is to become of Palestine and what later becomes the Palestinian Mandate under the British, but also a reaction to Zionism and sort of mass immigration into the area. From what we know of, I guess, a century or so of mass immigration or emigration or migration policy, whatever it might be. It causes tension, right? And so we see this with the Palestinian project or the Israeli project, whatever you call it. We see this, excuse me, sort of post Arab Spring, right? 2011, the collapse of a whole bunch of sort of Maghreb, Northern African states, and the collapse of Syria, and mass influx of migrants across the Mediterranean and through the land route into Greece and others, caused sort of a lashing out, it seems, over the last 15 years or so, and sort of a help to bring up harder immigration, arguably Brexit, um, and some other sort of racial tensions and things of that sort, right? And again, arguably, at least part of the puzzle as to the rise of sort of the far right again in Europe with sort of, I don't know, quasi or actual Nazi parties gaining power in Austria, Denmark, Germany, UK, these sorts of things, right? And so immigration uh, can always, almost always, cause tensions, cause organizations around stopping it or improving it or whatever it might be. So, in many ways, this is how the Palestinian project and Palestinian nationalism as sort of a concept came around. There's really 3 to 4 main reasons. One, again, the Ottoman collapse. Two, this idea of Palestinian nationhood, or I don't even want to say ethnicity, I don't know, nationalism, whatever, among not only the local Palestinian intelligentsia, but also sort of some of the people on the ground among the British, as the British were sort of protecting the area under the Palestinian Mandate. You also get high levels of immigration from Europe, from both Europe, right, and from Russian Jews, sort of fleeing the pogroms and landing in Jerusalem as they're trying to build out this project. And then finally, I wanted to add the Sykes-Picot Agreement and sort of British mismanagement, or influence, and the way that they drew maps and the sort of vagueness of some of the agreements they came to, which we'll talk about. And so, it wasn't really mentioned in the book, but I think it's an important piece too. Okay, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, is sort of established in the mid 60s. Um, we'll eventually talk about sort of Nasser's loss in 1967 and Israel sort of occupying the Egyptian Palestinian area and the Sinai Peninsula, including the Suez, which becomes very important. At that point, the sort of Egyptians and the Palestinians and the Syrians and the Jordanians, like, everybody's pretty embarrassed about 1967 war, and so they start to really militarize at this point, right? You get your first Intifada in 1987. This returns some control back to the Palestinians over the West Bank and Gaza. The Oslo Accords sort of lead to a quasi-statehood. They become what's called an observer to the UN. I'm not really sure what the rules around all this stuff are. Honestly, there are a few of these out there, like Taiwan, and I think Hong Kong was one for a while. Like the touchy areas that nobody really wants to declare a state, right? Because there are disagreements about what we should even call these territories, right? You later get the Palestinian National Authority, and there becomes a schism, right, between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which are sort of split territorially by the Israelis, and the Israelis are very, very controlling about who can pass between, right? Even though it is quote unquote one territory state, I don't know what to call it sometimes. Um, there becomes a schism eventually between Hamas, who is in Gaza, right, and sort of the PLA, the Palestinian Liberation Authority, who is run, who, yeah, President Mahmoud Abbas, but he was elected in 2005 and just never held elections again, so it's not like you really call it democratic, right? But the schism does happen, right? And there become different governing authorities in different territories of Palestine. Um, okay. Eventually, especially moving into the 70s and beyond, Palestine becomes sort of the siren call of the pan-Arab movement or Arabism, whatever. Uh, and it really is sort of an organizing principle in some ways, especially in the bloc that doesn't ally with the West. It becomes a bit of an organizing principle and a propaganda tool and all of these sorts of things as well. All right, let's talk about Nasser. Actually, you know what? I'm going to split it right here and I'll start Nasser in a moment. That way they're not too long. All right, thanks for being here. Have a great day.